Some stories are so impossible that most people dismiss them as coincidence. But if you're someone who believes that miracles are documented reality, not fairy tales, then what I'm about to share will challenge everything you think you know about the power of forgiveness and manifestation. Sarah Mitchell was standing in her kitchen at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March 2023, holding her husband's phone with shaking hands. The text message glowing on the screen contained words that would either destroy her completely or transform her into someone she never imagined she could become. "Can't wait to see you tonight, baby. Mark promised me he'll leave Sarah by Christmas. I love you." The message was from Jessica, her husband's coworker, sent at 2:33 a.m. while Sarah was working a double shift in the ICU, saving lives while her own was being shattered. But here's where this story becomes impossible to explain through conventional wisdom. Instead of choosing revenge, instead of exposing Mark publicly or destroying his career, Sarah Mitchell made a decision so radical that her own sister questioned her sanity. She got down on her knees in that same kitchen, tears streaming down her face, and began praying for Mark's happiness with Jessica. This is the kind of impossible story that changes everything you believe about reality. If you're someone who knows there's more to life than what we can see, you're going to want to follow this journey with me as I share the documented miracles that mainstream media refuses to touch. Because what happened to Sarah over the next 8 months wasn't just healing. It wasn't just moving on. What happened was a manifestation so perfect, so divinely orchestrated, that even the most skeptical observers had to acknowledge something supernatural was at work. The man she would marry 18 months later was someone she'd known for years but never truly seen. Someone who had been right there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for divine timing to reveal itself. Someone whose connection to her betrayal would make their love story seem impossible to anyone who didn't understand how the universe really works. Sarah Mitchell's story isn't just about surviving infidelity. It's about what happens when a human being chooses to align with love instead of revenge, with forgiveness instead of bitterness. It's about documented proof that our energy creates our reality, that our prayers are answered in ways we never expect, and that sometimes the greatest betrayals are actually divine redirections toward our true purpose. By the time you finish hearing what happened to Sarah, you'll understand why her story is being whispered about in spiritual circles across Texas and beyond. You'll see why 3 different pastors have used her experience in their sermons about the power of radical forgiveness. And you'll discover why the wedding video that went viral wasn't just celebrating a marriage, but documenting a miracle that proved manifestation isn't just possible, it's inevitable when we get our energy right. Sarah Mitchell had always been the kind of person who believed in signs. Growing up in a small Texas town where her grandmother read tea leaves and her mother lit candles for every prayer, she'd learned to pay attention to the subtle messages the universe sent. But nothing could have prepared her for the sign she was about to receive on that ordinary Tuesday morning. The alarm hadn't gone off. That should have been her first clue that this day would be different from all the others. Sarah woke naturally at 6:45 a.m., 2 hours before her shift at Houston Methodist Hospital, with an inexplicable urge to make Mark's favorite breakfast. Blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, the kind she usually only made on Sundays or anniversaries. She padded barefoot across the cold tile floor of their kitchen, her hospital scrubs from the previous night still clinging to her tired body. Mark's phone was charging on the counter, face up, exactly where he always left it. In 8 years of marriage, Sarah had never once looked through his phone. Trust was the foundation of their relationship, or so she believed. But as she reached for the spatula in the drawer beside his phone, the screen lit up with an incoming text message. "Can't wait to see you tonight, baby. Mark promised me he'll leave Sarah by Christmas. I love you." Time stopped. The kitchen suddenly felt arctic cold despite the Texas heat already building outside. Sarah's hands began trembling so violently that she had to grip the marble countertop to keep from falling. The sender's name was Jessica Martinez. She knew that name. Jessica worked in Mark's marketing department at the energy company downtown. Pretty Jessica with the long dark hair and the infectious laugh that Mark mentioned a little too often in his work stories. Sarah stared at those 22 words until they burned into her retinas. Mark promised me he'll leave Sarah by Christmas. The casual cruelty of it hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just being betrayed, she was being discussed, planned around, dismissed as an obstacle to be removed by a predetermined date. December 25th. Their anniversary was December 23rd. They'd been planning to renew their vows this year. The sound of Mark's footsteps on the stairs snapped her back to the moment. She quickly placed his phone exactly where she'd found it and turned toward the stove. But her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't light the burner. When Mark walked into the kitchen, freshly showered and humming some tune she didn't recognize, Sarah was standing motionless in front of the cold stove, still holding an unlit match. "You okay, babe?" Mark asked, kissing the top of her head the way he had every morning for 8 years. But now his lips felt like ice against her skin. "You look pale. Maybe you should call in sick today." Sarah turned to look at her husband. Really look at him. This man she'd met in college, who'd held her hand through nursing school, who'd cried with her through 3 miscarriages, who'd promised her forever in a little chapel in Austin surrounded by sunflowers and her grandmother's blessing. This man whose blue eyes now seemed like strangers' eyes, whose familiar face suddenly looked foreign and guilty. "I'm fine," she managed to whisper, though every word felt like swallowing glass. "Just tired from the double shift." Mark nodded and grabbed his phone, sliding it into his pocket without checking it. How many other messages were there? How long had this been going on? As he poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made, chattering about his day ahead, about the client meeting that would probably run late, about how he might not be home for dinner again, every word felt like another knife twisting in her chest. She watched him leave for work that morning, his kiss goodbye feeling like a betrayal in itself. The moment his car disappeared around the corner, Sarah collapsed onto their couch and called in sick to work. She couldn't trust herself to care for other people's lives when her own was disintegrating. For the next 6 hours, Sarah sat in their living room, staring at their wedding photos on the mantel, trying to figure out when everything had gone wrong. When had Mark stopped loving her? When had he started loving Jessica Martinez? The woman was 26, 4 years younger than Sarah, with no gray threads in her hair and no C-section scar across her belly from the baby they'd lost at 7 months 3 years ago. By the time Mark came home that evening, claiming exhaustion from his client meeting, Sarah had made a decision that would change everything. She didn't confront him. She didn't scream or throw things or demand explanations. Instead, she looked at this man she'd loved for over a decade and realized she was looking at a stranger who happened to share her last name. "How was your day?" she asked quietly. "Long, boring, the usual." Mark loosened his tie and headed toward the stairs. "I'm beat. Going to bed early." That night, Sarah lay beside her husband in their king-sized bed, listening to him breathe, knowing he was probably thinking about Jessica Martinez. Knowing that in less than 3 months, according to Jessica's text, he planned to leave her. The betrayal felt like acid in her veins, but underneath the pain was something else. Something that felt almost like relief, because now she knew the truth. And truth, her grandmother had always told her, was the beginning of all real transformation. The next morning, Sarah woke up before dawn with a clarity that surprised her. The crushing weight in her chest was still there, but alongside it was something she hadn't expected, a strange sense of peace. She slipped out of bed while Mark was still sleeping and walked to their back porch, where she'd always done her best thinking. The Texas sunrise was painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and for the first time in years, Sarah really saw it. Every color seemed more vivid, every bird song more distinct. It was as if discovering Mark's betrayal had somehow sharpened her senses, awakened her to details she'd been too busy to notice during 8 years of sleepwalking through her marriage. She made coffee and sat in her grandmother's rocking chair, the one she'd inherited after Mima passed 5 years ago. The chair where her grandmother had taught her to pray, to listen for God's voice in the quiet moments before the world woke up. Sarah closed her eyes and waited for guidance. What came wasn't anger. It wasn't a plan for revenge. Instead, what filled her mind was her grandmother's voice. as clear as if she were sitting right there beside her. Baby girl, hurt people, but healed people heal people. Which one you gonna choose to be? If you're still watching this, it means you're exactly the kind of person who believes in the impossible. There's a community of us here who understand that miracles aren't fairy tales, they're documented reality. Hit that subscribe button, because what's coming next in Sarah's story will challenge everything you thought you knew about the power of radical forgiveness. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single miracle that's documented right here on this channel. Sarah spent the entire morning wrestling with an idea so radical it made her question her own sanity. By the time Mark left for work, giving her the same perfunctory kiss goodbye, she'd made a decision that would horrify every divorce attorney in Texas. She was going to pray for Mark's happiness, not just his general well-being, but specifically his happiness with Jessica Martinez. Her sister Linda was the first person to question her mental state when Sarah shared her plan during their weekly phone call that evening. "Are you having some kind of breakdown?" Linda's voice crackled through the phone from her home in Dallas. "Sarah, honey, normal people hire lawyers when they find out their husband is cheating. They don't start prayer circles for the mistress." "I'm not starting a prayer circle," Sarah said calmly, folding laundry in her bedroom while Mark worked late again. "I'm just choosing not to hate them." There's a difference between not hating someone and actively praying for their romantic success. Linda shot back. "What you're talking about isn't forgiveness, it's martyrdom. And it's going to backfire spectacularly." But Sarah had already started. That first night, kneeling beside her bed while Mark showered, she whispered the most difficult prayer of her life. "God, if Mark is happier with Jessica, then please bless their relationship. Help them find the love they're looking for, even if it means losing him forever." The words felt like broken glass coming out of her mouth, but something strange happened as she spoke them. The crushing weight in her chest shifted, just slightly. Not gone, but different somehow. Lighter. She continued this impossible practice. Every morning and every evening for 2 weeks. Mark remained oblivious, coming home later and later, his explanations becoming more elaborate and less believable. Jessica's texts continued appearing on his phone whenever Sarah happened to be nearby. Messages about weekend plans, about apartment hunting, about how excited Jessica was to finally go public after Christmas. But the most shocking thing wasn't Mark's escalating deception. It was how Sarah's own life began changing in ways she couldn't explain. Her supervisor at the hospital commented on her unusual calmness during a particularly chaotic shift. "Mitchell, I don't know what you've been doing differently, but you handled that trauma like you've been doing this for 20 years instead of 5. Your energy is completely different." Her patients started requesting her specifically. Family members thanked her for bringing peace to difficult situations. Dr. Rodriguez, the head of the ICU, pulled her aside after she'd successfully calmed a violent psychiatric patient that 3 male nurses couldn't handle. "Sarah, I've been watching you work for years, but something has changed. You have this presence now that's almost healing just by itself. Have you been taking meditation classes?" She hadn't been taking classes. She'd been praying for her cheating husband's happiness with his mistress, but she couldn't exactly put that in her employee review. The most unexpected change came on a Thursday evening in late April. Sarah had just finished her prayer for Mark and Jessica when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in months. David Chen, Mark's best friend since college. "Sarah. Hey, I hope I'm not calling too late. I just wanted to check on you. Mark mentioned you've been working a lot of extra shifts, and I know how stressful that can be." David's voice was warm and genuinely concerned in a way that made Sarah's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. When was the last time her own husband had sounded that worried about her well-being? "I'm okay," she managed. "Just the usual hospital craziness. Are you sure? You sound different. Tired maybe." There was something in David's tone that made Sarah pause. She and David had always gotten along well during the years of double dates and group gatherings, but they'd never really talked one. He was Mark's friend, the successful architect who designed beautiful homes and sent thoughtful Christmas cards and always remembered to ask about her patients when they met at parties. David, Can I ask you something? The words came out before she could stop them. Of course. Do you think people can change? I mean really change, not just temporarily but permanently. There was a long pause. When David spoke again, his voice was softer, more careful. Sarah, is everything okay? Did something happen with Mark? The genuine concern in his voice almost undid her completely. Here was someone who barely knew her, calling just to check on her well-being, while her husband of 8 years was planning his exit strategy with his mistress. No, nothing happened. I'm just going through some personal growth, I guess. Trying to figure out who I want to be. Well, to answer your question, yes, I absolutely believe people can change. I've seen it happen. Sometimes the most beautiful transformations come from the most difficult circumstances. After they hung up, Sarah sat in her kitchen holding the phone, wondering why a 5-minute conversation with David had made her feel more seen and valued than months of interactions with her own husband. She was about to learn that the universe had been orchestrating something far more complex than she could have imagined. By May, Sarah's commitment to praying for Mark and Jessica's happiness had created changes in her life that defied logical explanation. The shift was so profound that even strangers began commenting on the energy she carried. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly patient in the cardiac unit, gripped Sarah's hand during a particularly difficult night and whispered, "Honey, you've got healing light coming out of your fingertips. I can feel it. Whatever you've been doing, don't stop." Sarah wanted to laugh. What she'd been doing was systematically praying for her own romantic demise. But somehow, this impossible practice of radical forgiveness was transforming her in ways she couldn't have predicted. Her health improved dramatically. The chronic headaches that had plagued her for 2 years vanished completely. She lost 12 pounds without changing her diet. Her skin cleared, her hair became shinier, and she started sleeping through the night, despite the emotional turmoil of her crumbling marriage. More importantly, opportunities began presenting themselves as if the universe was rearranging itself around her new energy. Dr. Martinez, the chief of staff, approached her about leading a new holistic care program that would integrate spiritual wellness into patient treatment. "Sarah, your approach with difficult patients has become legendary around here. We want to build an entire program around your methods." The promotion would mean a significant salary increase and the chance to pioneer healing approaches that combined medical science with spiritual principles. Everything she'd dreamed of professionally was suddenly within reach, but the most significant change was happening in her personal life, in ways she never could have anticipated. David started calling more frequently, always with legitimate reasons, asking about Mark's schedule for guys' night, coordinating surprise birthday plans for mutual friends, checking on her well-being with increasing concern. But their conversations began lasting longer, diving deeper into topics that Mark had never seemed interested in discussing with her. "I've been thinking about what you said about people changing," David mentioned during one of their calls in mid-May. "There's something different about you lately, Sarah. Even Mark has commented on it. You seem more centered somehow. More yourself, if that makes sense." Mark had noticed. That was news to Sarah, considering he barely looked at her anymore, except to create alibis for his evening absences. "What did Mark say exactly?" she asked, curious despite herself. "He said you've been glowing lately. That you seem happier than you've been in years. He was actually wondering if you'd started seeing someone." The irony was breathtaking. Mark was so consumed with his own deception that he'd misinterpreted his wife's spiritual transformation as evidence of an affair. Meanwhile, Jessica's texts continued appearing on his phone with increasing frequency and decreasing discretion. "I'm seeing someone," Sarah said quietly. "I'm seeing myself for the first time in years." "That's beautiful," David replied, and something in his tone made her heart skip unexpectedly. "The right person will be lucky to discover who you really are." That night, Sarah knelt beside her bed for her usual prayer, but the words felt different in her mouth. "God, bless Mark and Jessica. Help them find their happiness together. And help me understand what you're preparing me for." The answer came sooner than she expected. 3 days later, Sarah was leaving the hospital after a particularly intense shift, when her car wouldn't start. Dead battery, according to the security guard who tried to help. She was standing in the parking garage at 11:30 p.m., contemplating an expensive Uber ride home, when a familiar voice called her name, Sarah. Car trouble. She turned to find David walking toward her, still dressed in the expensive suit he wore for client meetings, looking concerned and slightly out of breath. Dead battery, she said, suddenly self-conscious about her wrinkled scrubs and the exhaustion she knew showed on her face. What are you doing here so late? Hospital board meeting. New wing design presentation. He gestured toward the administrative offices. Come on, I'll give you a ride home. We can deal with your car tomorrow. During the 20-minute drive to her house, something shifted between them. David asked about her day with genuine interest, listening to her stories about difficult patients and small victories with the kind of attention Mark hadn't shown her in years. When she asked about his work, he talked about designing spaces that could heal people, about architecture that supported spiritual well-being. I've always believed that our environment affects our soul, he said as they pulled into her driveway. The right space can literally change someone's life. Like the right person can change someone's perspective. Sarah asked, then immediately felt her cheeks flush. Where had that come from? David turned to look at her, and in the dim light from her porch, she saw something in his dark eyes that made her breath catch. Recognition, understanding, something that felt dangerously close to attraction. Yes, he said softly. Exactly like that. They sat in his car for another 10 minutes, talking about everything and nothing, until Sarah realized that Mark's BMW wasn't in the driveway. Another late night at the office, another evening with Jessica. Sarah, David said as she reached for the door handle. I know this might sound strange, but if you ever need anything, please call me. Not because you're Mark's wife, but because you're you. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening to her. For 2 months, she'd been praying for Mark's happiness with another woman, and instead of destroying her, it was transforming her into someone she'd never been before. Someone confident and radiant and apparently attractive to men like David Chen. She was beginning to suspect that the universe had a sense of humor, and possibly a plan she hadn't seen coming. The next morning, her prayer took on an entirely new dimension. God, I'm starting to understand that this isn't just about Mark and Jessica's happiness. This is about mine too. Show me what you're preparing me for. Within hours, she would get an answer that would change everything she thought she knew about divine timing. The answer came at 3:17 a.m. on a Saturday morning in June, when Sarah's phone rang with the kind of call that changes everything. The caller ID showed Houston Methodist's main number, and her heart immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. Was there an emergency? Had someone died on her unit? Sarah, this is Dr. Rodriguez. I'm sorry to wake you, but we have a situation. There's been a major accident on I-45, multiple vehicles, several critical patients coming in, and we're short-staffed. I know it's your weekend off, but I need my best people here. Sarah was already pulling on her scrubs before he finished talking. I'll be there in 20 minutes. What she didn't expect was to find David Chen in the hospital lobby when she arrived, pacing frantically, and covered in what looked like blood on his white dress shirt. David, what are you doing here? Are you hurt? He looked up at her with relief, so profound it was almost palpable. Sarah, thank God. I was in the accident. My car got clipped, but I'm fine. It's my passenger who's in trouble. Your passenger. My cousin Lisa. She's visiting from San Francisco, and I was taking her to the airport for an early flight. When the semi jackknifed, we got caught in the pileup. She's unconscious. Possible head trauma. They won't tell me anything because I'm not immediate family. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. What's her full name? I'll find out what I can. For the next 6 hours, Sarah became David's lifeline to information about his cousin's condition. During brief breaks from the chaos of treating multiple trauma patients, she would find him in the waiting room and update him on Lisa's progress. Brain surgery to relieve pressure from swelling. Critical but stable condition. The neurosurgeon was optimistic about her recovery. What struck Sarah most wasn't just David's obvious love for his family, but how he handled the crisis. No angry outbursts at staff, no demands for special treatment, just quiet gratitude for every piece of information and genuine concern for the other families dealing with their own emergencies. "You've been incredible," he told her during one of her check-ins around noon. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "This is what we do," Sarah said simply. "We take care of people." "No, this is what you do. There's a difference." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. David's usual composed demeanor had cracked slightly, revealing a vulnerability that made her want to comfort him in ways that had nothing to do with professional duty. "David, when was the last time you ate or slept?" "I don't remember." "Yesterday sometime." Without hesitation, Sarah made a decision that would have surprised her former self. "Come with me." She led him to the small break room on her unit, where she kept emergency snacks for long shifts. While she heated up leftover soup in the microwave, David sat at the small table looking exhausted and grateful in a way that made her heart ache. "You know," he said as she placed the steaming bowl in front of him, "in all the years I've known Mark, he's never once mentioned how extraordinary you are." The comment hit her like cold water. Mark, her husband, who at this very moment was probably spending his Saturday afternoon with Jessica, blissfully unaware that his wife was having what could only be described as an emotional affair with his best friend. "David, we should talk about that." "About what?" "About the fact that I'm married to your best friend. About the fact that what's happening between us isn't appropriate." David set down his spoon and looked at her directly. "What is happening between us, Sarah?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. For 3 months, she'd been praying for her husband's happiness with another woman, while her own heart was slowly awakening to possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know it's not fair to any of us. What if I told you that Mark has been planning to leave you?" Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about?" "He asked me about divorce lawyers 3 weeks ago. Said he'd fallen in love with someone else and needed to know how to protect his assets during the separation." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Sarah gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "He told you about Jessica. So you know." "I've known since March. I found text messages." David stared at her in disbelief. "You've known for 3 months and you haven't said anything." "I've been praying for his happiness with her." The silence that followed lasted several heartbeats. David's expression shifted through confusion, amazement, and something that looked like awe. "Sarah, do you realize how extraordinary that is? Most people would have hired a private investigator and a pit bull attorney. You've been blessing your husband's affair. It seemed like the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. It's also the most spiritually advanced response I've ever witnessed to betrayal." David reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "But what about your happiness? What about what you deserve?" The warmth of his touch sent electricity through her entire nervous system. This was dangerous territory, but Sarah found herself powerless to pull away. "I'm starting to think that maybe my prayers weren't just about Mark and Jessica," she said quietly. "Maybe they were about clearing space for something else, something better." "Like what?" Before she could answer, her pager buzzed with an emergency. Lisa Chen was waking up from surgery, asking for David. As they hurried toward the IC, Sarah caught David's reflection in the elevator's polished steel doors. He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on any man's face before. Not desire exactly, though that was there too. It was recognition. The look of someone who had just discovered something precious he hadn't known he was searching for. Lisa's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Within hours, she was sitting up, talking coherently, and teasing David about his worried expression. The neurosurgeon called it one of the best outcomes he'd seen in similar cases. "Someone upstairs must really love you, Dr. Martinez told David, as they prepared Lisa for transfer to a regular room. David looked directly at Sarah when he replied, "I'm beginning to think you're right." That evening, after Lisa was stable and David's family had arrived from California, He found Sarah in the parking garage where her car battery had died just weeks earlier. "I got your battery fixed," he said, holding up her keys. "Seemed like the least I could do." "David, you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. Because I'm falling in love with you, Sarah, and I needed to do something useful with all this energy I don't know what to do with." The confession hung between them in the humid Texas air. Sarah felt her world shift on its axis. Felt everything she thought she knew about her life rearranging itself around this moment. "I'm still married," she whispered. "To a man who's planning to leave you for another woman. That doesn't make this right." "No, it doesn't. But it makes it inevitable." David stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Sarah, I believe in divine timing. I believe that everything that's happened, including that accident today, has been orchestrated to bring us to this moment. The universe doesn't make mistakes." When he kissed her, soft and tentative and full of promise, Sarah understood that her prayers for Mark's happiness had been answered in a way she never could have anticipated. They'd freed her to discover a love she hadn't known was possible. As they stood in that parking garage, holding each other like they were both afraid the moment might disappear, Sarah realized that sometimes the greatest betrayals are actually divine interventions in disguise. What happened over the next 3 months would become the subject of spiritual discussion groups across Texas and beyond, because Sarah's story wasn't just about finding love after betrayal. It was about what happens when someone aligns so completely with divine will that the universe begins orchestrating miracles that benefit everyone involved. The first miracle was Mark's transformation. 2 weeks after Sarah and David's first kiss, Mark came home from work with an expression she hadn't seen in years, peaceful, almost serene. "Sarah, we need to talk." She'd been expecting this conversation since March, but now that it was here, she felt surprisingly calm. They sat on their back porch, in the chairs where she'd done her morning prayers for his happiness, and Mark began speaking with an honesty that shocked them both. "I've been having an affair with Jessica from work. I know you probably suspected something." "I knew," Sarah said simply. Mark's composure cracked. "You knew? How long have you known?" "Since March. I saw the texts." "Sarah, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you confront me?" She looked at this man she'd loved for so many years, and felt nothing but compassion for the confusion and guilt written across his face. "Because I wanted you to be happy. Even if that meant being happy without me." What happened next was something Mark would later describe to 3 different therapists as the most spiritually profound moment of his life. As Sarah spoke about her months of praying for his happiness with Jessica, about choosing forgiveness over revenge, about blessing their relationship instead of fighting it, Mark began to cry in a way he hadn't cried since he was a child. "You've been praying for my happiness with another woman for 3 months. Every morning and every evening, Sarah. That's the most loving thing anyone has ever done for me. And it's also made me realize that what I'm doing with Jessica isn't love. It's escape. It's fear of growing up and taking responsibility for the man I want to become." The conversation lasted until sunrise. Mark talked about feeling trapped by expectations, about missing the excitement of being 25, about how Jessica represented a fantasy of recapturing his youth, rather than genuine love. Sarah listened without judgment, continuing to extend the same grace she'd been practicing in prayer for months. "I want to end things with Jessica," Mark said as the sun painted the sky in familiar shades of pink and gold. "I want to fight for our marriage." Sarah took his hand gently. "Mark, I appreciate that, more than you know. But I've changed over these months. I've discovered who I am when I'm not trying to hold on to something that wasn't meant to be. And I think you need to discover that too." "Are you saying you want a divorce?" "I'm saying I want us both to be authentic. To stop trying to force something that's become obligation instead of joy." The divorce proceedings were unlike anything their lawyers had ever witnessed. No fighting over assets. No bitter custody battles, since they'd never had children together. No attempts to punish or destroy each other financially or emotionally. Instead, Mark and Sarah worked together to dissolve their marriage, with the same grace that had characterized Sarah's response to his affair. Jessica, when she learned about the divorce, was initially thrilled. But when Mark explained that he wouldn't be continuing their relationship either, that he needed time to figure out who he was outside of both marriages and affairs, she was devastated. The man she thought she'd won had discovered something more valuable than her love, his own integrity. "Sarah changed me," Mark told Jessica during their final conversation. "Not by fighting me or punishing me, but by loving me enough to let me go. That's the kind of love I want to learn how to give someone someday." Meanwhile, Sarah and David's relationship unfolded with a naturalness that amazed everyone who witnessed it. Their first official date was to a spiritual bookstore and coffee shop, where they spent 4 hours discussing everything from manifestation principles to their dreams for the future. Their second date was a volunteer shift at a homeless shelter, where they served meals and discovered they shared the same vision of service-based living. By September, David had introduced Sarah to his family, who immediately embraced her as if she'd always been part of their circle. His mother, a wise woman who'd emigrated from Taiwan with powerful intuition about people's character, pulled Sarah aside after their first family dinner. "I've been praying for the right woman for my son for 10 years, she said with tears in her eyes. "You are the answered prayer I didn't know how to ask for." Sarah's own family was more complicated. Her sister Linda remained skeptical of the entire situation. "You're marrying your ex-husband's best friend less than a year after your divorce. How is that not messy and problematic?" But even Linda had to admit that Sarah had never looked happier or more radiant. The transformation was visible to everyone who knew her. She'd started the holistic care program at the hospital, which was already showing remarkable success rates with difficult patients. She'd lost another 10 pounds without trying. Her skin glowed with health, and she carried herself with a confidence that made strangers smile at her on the street. More importantly, Sarah and David's relationship was healing other relationships around them. Mark, inspired by Sarah's example of radical forgiveness, had entered therapy and was working on becoming the kind of man who could love someone without deception. He'd started volunteering at a crisis counseling center and was discovering a calling toward helping other men navigate relationship challenges with integrity. Jessica, devastated by losing Mark, had initially been bitter toward Sarah. But when Sarah reached out to her personally, offering forgiveness and even friendship, Jessica experienced her own spiritual awakening. She entered her own therapy, left the marketing company where she'd met Mark, and eventually started a nonprofit organization focused on helping women build healthy relationships. "Sarah taught me that you can't build happiness on someone else's pain," Jessica would later tell friends. "Watching how she handled the entire situation changed my whole understanding of what love actually looks like." The wedding took place exactly 1 year after Sarah's first prayer for Mark's happiness. It was held in the garden of the meditation center, where Sarah had started attending weekly spiritual discussion groups, surrounded by sunflowers that reminded everyone of her grandmother's favorite flower. Mark attended the ceremony, not as a bitter ex-husband, but as someone who had been transformed by witnessing radical love in action. During the reception, he stood up to give a toast that moved everyone to tears. "Sarah Mitchell Chen is living proof that miracles happen when we choose love over fear, forgiveness over revenge, faith over control. She saved my soul by refusing to fight for a marriage that had become a prison for both of us. And she gave David the greatest gift possible, a woman who knows how to love without conditions, without demands, without trying to change the person she's with into someone they're not." The wedding video, which Sarah's cousin posted on social media, went viral within days, not because it was lavish or celebrity-filled, but because it documented something people rarely see: the visible presence of divine orchestration. Everyone who watched it could feel the rightness of what they were witnessing. The sense that this wasn't just a wedding but a manifestation of spiritual principles in action. 3 months after the wedding, Sarah and David received their first letter from a stranger who had watched their story online. A woman in Michigan who was going through her own marital crisis had started praying for her cheating husband's happiness instead of planning revenge. Within weeks, her own life had begun transforming in miraculous ways. More letters followed. A man in Oregon whose wife had left him for another man started blessing their relationship instead of fighting the divorce. A woman in Florida facing bankruptcy began expressing gratitude for her financial challenges and watching new opportunities appear. Couples who had watched Sarah's wedding video began incorporating radical forgiveness practices into their own relationships. Reporting improvements that seemed impossible to explain through conventional therapy alone. Sarah and David realized they were witnessing the ripple effects of aligned spiritual living. Their story had become a template, a proof of concept that choosing love over fear actually works in practical, measurable ways. By their first anniversary, they had launched a ministry focused on spiritual approaches to relationship healing, not as experts or gurus, but as living examples of what becomes possible when people align their actions with divine principles instead of ego-driven reactions. Their marriage itself continued to be a daily demonstration of the principles that had brought them together. No jealousy, because they'd both learned that true love wants the beloved to be happy above all else. No possessiveness, because they understood that trying to control another person destroys the very connection you're trying to preserve. No fear-based decisions, because they'd seen how faith-based choices create miracles that benefit everyone involved. Sarah's final prayer had evolved too. Instead of praying for specific outcomes, she now prayed for alignment with whatever would serve the highest good of all. And the universe, it seemed, was eager to show her just how magnificent that alignment could be. 3 years after that devastating morning when Sarah found Jessica's text message, she stands in the same kitchen where her world once shattered, but everything has changed. The marble countertops are the same, the view from the window identical, but the woman preparing breakfast is transformed beyond recognition. The phone on the counter belongs to David now, and when it lights up with messages, they're from clients thanking him for designing healing spaces. From Sarah's hospital colleagues, sharing patient success stories. From couples around the world who've applied Sarah's radical forgiveness principles to their own relationships with miraculous results. This morning's text message reads, "Sarah, your story saved my marriage. When I started praying for my husband's happiness instead of fighting his depression, everything changed. He's in therapy now, we're closer than we've ever been, and he says I'm glowing. Thank you for showing me that love is stronger than fear." Sarah smiles as she reads it, remembering the terror she felt that March morning when love seemed like the most dangerous choice she could make. Now she understands that love isn't dangerous. Fear is dangerous. Control is dangerous. Trying to force outcomes instead of trusting divine orchestration is what destroys lives and relationships. David walks into their kitchen, the same kitchen where Sarah's old life died and her real life began, and kisses her forehead with the same tenderness he showed during those early days when they were both afraid to hope for something so beautiful. "Another miracle story?" he asks, nodding toward the phone. "Another miracle story," Sarah confirms. They've received over 3,000 messages now from people whose lives have been transformed by choosing radical forgiveness over revenge, blessing over bitterness, faith over fear. Their story has become a template for spiritual living that works in the real world, producing measurable results that confound therapists and inspire spiritual teachers. But the greatest miracle isn't the thousands of lives they've touched. It's not even the perfect marriage they've built on a foundation of authentic love, instead of desperate need. The greatest miracle is standing in this kitchen, in this moment, knowing with absolute certainty that every prayer she whispered through those dark months was answered in ways more beautiful than she could have imagined. Mark found his integrity, and is now happily married to a woman who loves him for who he actually is, not who she wants him to become. Jessica discovered her own worth and built a life based on genuine self-love, rather than stealing someone else's happiness. David found the soulmate he'd been unconsciously seeking for 35 years, and Sarah discovered that she was never the victim in her story. She was the miracle worker, who had been waiting for the right circumstances to reveal her true power. When people ask her how she knew to choose forgiveness over revenge, Sarah always gives the same answer: "I didn't know. I just trusted that love would show me the way, even when I couldn't see where the path was leading." The text messages continue coming because Sarah's story proves something that changes everything once you truly believe it. Miracles aren't exceptions to the rules of reality. They're what happens when we align our choices with the deepest laws of love that govern the universe. And in a kitchen in Texas where heartbreak once lived, love now makes breakfast every morning. Surrounded by the visible proof that choosing the impossible path sometimes leads to destinations more beautiful than dreams. Sarah's story isn't just about one woman's miraculous transformation. It's about the power that lives inside every single person watching this right now. The same divine intelligence that orchestrated Sarah's impossible love story is available to you, waiting for you to make the choice that seems too radical, too risky, too beautiful to be real. Maybe you're facing your own betrayal, your own heartbreak, your own moment of devastating discovery. Maybe you're standing in your own kitchen, holding your own phone, staring at evidence that your world isn't what you thought it was. The question isn't whether you'll survive this moment. The question is whether you'll use this moment to discover who you really are when you stop trying to control outcomes and start trusting divine timing. Every person who has ever experienced a miracle made the same choice. Sarah made that morning when she got down on her knees and chose love over revenge. They chose to align with something bigger than their pain, something more powerful than their fear, something more intelligent than their desperate need to control what other people do. Your miracle is waiting for you to make that same choice. Not because you're strong enough to force it into existence, but because you're wise enough to trust that love knows what it's doing, even when you don't. The universe is conspiring for your happiness right now, arranging synchronicities and divine appointments and impossible possibilities that will only reveal themselves when you're ready to receive them. When you're ready to become the person who attracts miracles not by demanding them, but by embodying the love that creates them. Sarah Mitchell Chen started praying for her cheating husband's happiness and ended up manifesting the most beautiful love story anyone in her family had ever witnessed. What would happen if you started blessing the very situation that's breaking your heart right now? There's only one way to find out, and your miracle is waiting for you to be brave enough to try.